Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I just wanted to introduce myself as well. So I have kind of a mixed background. I come from a background in paleoanthropology and mathematics, but I'm currently doing my PhD in a population genetics lab, so it's kind of an amalgamation of everything. But the string that ties it all together is I'm really interested in developing quantitative models to infer population history, particularly demographics of recent population history, the last, say, 20,000 years. So I want to thank you for the invitation, especially you'll see in a minute why it's really exciting for me and based on this work to be talking about the Amazon in particular. But first I want to take a step back, and rather than focusing on the Amazon, I hope to motivate the work that is being done and provide kind of a broad context for continental scale demography in South America. So the last 20,000 years were a period of dramatic cultural and climatic change, and I want to focus on two of those time periods. The first is the end of the last glacial maximum. We have dramatic sea level rises and warming, and this occurs at the same time, or actually a little bit after, the first people arrive in the Americas through a land bridge with Siberia. The second time period is the Middle Holocene, which, kind of giving a lenient or wide definition, we'll call, say, 3,000 to 8,000 years ago, with differential warming and cooling depending on the region, and substantial regional and temporal variation, particularly in changes in the amount of precipitation and the effect of climate change. At the same time, starting around 10,000 years ago, some human populations began to shift to large-scale domestication and sedentary farming lifestyles. So some small-scale domestication occurred before this, but these large-scale societies that are economically agricultural, we'll say around 10,000 years ago, depending on the region. And this shift occurred somewhat independently with mixed migration in a number of regions worldwide over thousands of years. Each relied on their own set of domesticated crops and animals, and we don't really understand, or we're still starting to understand the variation between these regions and how that impacted human populations. So now you know kind of the temporal perspective that I'm interested in, so why South America? I don't think I have to convince anyone here that South American prehistory is particularly interesting, but I also want to make the point that South America as a continent, studying it can be particularly informative about human behavior in general, and some of this was alluded to earlier. So just to be a little more descriptive, some interesting points about South America that will come up in this work. There's kind of this complex domestication history. It's the source of multiple domestication hotspots. And this is kind of a sharp contrast to the European Neolithic, which is kind of space and time period that is one of the most well-studied ever. And in Europe, for example, there was a large-scale migration, largely from a single source that had already developed an agricultural system from Anatolia and shifting into Europe. In South America, on the other hand, as we've already started to hear, there's a number of domesticated crops, not so many animals, that occur in different places at different times and occur for a long time before a real shift to an exclusively agricultural society. It's kind of a supplement to hunting and gathering in a lot of places. Additionally, South America is the home to the largest Pleistocene megafaunal extinction, and this is important particularly for my work because my collaborators are all paleontologists and ecologists. So this is actually what motivated the work initially. They were interested in the kind of dynamics of climate and human interactions on the megafaunal extinctions, and none of them really knew anything or cared about humans, and so that's where I came in. And importantly, at least as far as we can tell so far, South America was roughly peopled through one main point. Everyone on the continent, in the early continent, came either by land or close neighboring water through Panama around, say, 15,000 years ago. And this is a stark contrast to North America even, and particularly Europe, where we know there are large-scale migrations replacing a large proportion of the individuals later in time. Therefore, and similarly in other parts of the world, there were already people of some sort, say Neanderthals or Denisovans or other human populations. So it isn't this uninhabited continent that we have in the Americas. So the Americas really allow us to test questions about how humans spread in a natural environment and adapt ecologically and culturally to the new uninhabited continent. To kind of put that more specifically, we want to know, how does human population size change over time and space during the peopling of South America? And I'm talking about peopling kind of more generally than just the initial few people that entered, but rather the amount of time that it took to like fully expand and spread throughout the continent. And to do that, I'm going to look at a database of radiocarbon dates that my co-author Alexis compiled. So she, unlike me, speaks Spanish and tried to go through as much of the Spanish and some Portuguese literature that she could. As I've discussed with some of you, there's probably gaps whenever you're working in this scale. There will be gaps in literature, and I really encourage you to let me know, and we'll try and incorporate them, and she's working through that right now. But as far as we could tell, for dates that have human-associated radiocarbon dated material, we have about 5,500 radiocarbon dates from over 1,000 archaeological sites. And we're only considering the date range in uncalibrated radiocarbon years of, say, the earliest, earliest really confirmed Monteverde site to 2,000 years ago. And just as a, by the way, this calibrates to about like 14.6, 14.8. So looking at the spatial spread of our sites, we do some quality control and binning to prevent oversampling at certain sites. We end up with about 2,500 what we call independent events. They aren't really independent, but we're going to treat them as they are because of this like binning within 200 years over these 1,100 sites. And this is the location of all the sites. And to make it a little more clear, you can look at an intensity map of those dates, and you'll see there's this large gap here. So really we want to emphasize that we need more data, and we need different types of data to look at the questions that we're asking here in the Amazon, and that's really what this workshop is about. I also want to make the point that absence of evidence, especially in the Amazon, where preservation of radiocarbon material is horrible, is not evidence of absence. So first, looking at the distribution of humans geographically in these time bins. So we're just going to take all of those sites and plot them as they occur in 1,000-year time bins. And we look at that by using a kernel density smoothing algorithm. So if we have a bunch of input sites, then you basically plot a distribution around each site with an intensity, and your output is this raster, which is kind of a smoothed occurrence or density estimate based on the sites. We can look first in each time bin, so kind of with early sites. We see a really wide geographic spread of humans throughout the continents. And then looking through other time bins, these are now calibrated dates. Everything from now on is calibrated dates. You can see substantial geographic variation and temporal variation with large populations around the coast, as well as known geographic city centers later in time. But we don't want to over-interpret our regional variation here because of confounding effects of sampling. And while we do things to kind of control for them, such as the binning and pruning, we can't completely. So we want to turn to kind of complementary analyses to look at patterns that hold over the whole continent. So just as a quick summary, I think everyone here already knows this, the calibration of a radiocarbon date with the calibration curve gives you a distribution of calendar dates, which is non-normal as opposed to the radiocarbon date, which is normal. And we do all of our analyses in OxCal, and we sum over, so each individual date gives us a distribution like this. In OxCal, we use the sum function to do a convolution of all of those individual dates and give us one probability distribution for the whole time period. So that looks something like these. So these are examples, previous examples from different worldwide regions, including Europe, North America, and Australia. And this has also been done on regional scales within South America, but because there hasn't been a single database for all of South America, we haven't really been able to look at continental patterns in South America like we could in these other regions. Oh, and one other important point is that these are relative population sizes, not an actual number. You'd have to make some sort of assumption about how the density of material relates to number of individuals, which is a little bit farther than we're willing to go. So some points about interpretation. So this method, which we call there's a lot of different ways that people abbreviate this, but the sum calibrated probability densities assumes that the amount of material that you're dating, these radiocarbon dates, is proportional to the amount left and proportional to the number of people who are actually there. And this may or may not be true. Different types of societies, hunter-gatherers versus sedentary populations, may distribute material differently. We may radiocarbon date material differently depending on what we're interested in or how much money we have to excavate a site. And there are other kind of intrinsic issues, such as the peaks and troughs within the density curve may be caused from the kind of squiggly lines you have in the calibration curve, or uneven sampling in time and space. You have to balance having a large enough sample size to say something meaningful with kind of inferring over too large a range of a single population history, as well as taphonomic degradation, which, for example, comparing the Amazon to, say, the Atacama. That said, there's a lot of evidence there's a lot of evidence that these curves really do represent real processes. So there have been studies kind of in a lot of different worldwide regions that these density curves correlate really nicely with other measures of population size, different land usage measures, the numbers of sites or burials or structures, depending on the region, as well as extensive work based on simulations to try and understand the parameter values in which you can really interpret these, how many, like what sample size you need over what time period, et cetera. And we take a lot of steps to kind of actively control for these measures based on recommendations in the literature and some simulations to check what we're doing. So just kind of to sum it up, it's a useful tool, particularly for finding these high-level patterns, but you have to be careful about over-interpretation. So what does the curve for South America look like? So the gray line is just the raw data, and the black line is kind of a 400-year moving average to prevent kind of overinterpretation of the squiggly lines. You can kind of see general patterns. You know, there weren't a lot of people before there were people in South America. That makes sense. Rapid increase in what's going on here. So we want to take so we can see some general trends, but we can't really interpret them without considering the underlying processes that generate both the curve and the data. One kind of first check we can do is plot a histogram of dates. So here, instead of a distribution, each date is just 1 point in a bin for both calibrated and uncalibrated dates. And we can just check that you do, in fact, see like the same general pattern. So it's a sanity check, and yes, that looks good. The calibrated and uncalibrated are slightly shifted because of the calibration process, especially in the early times. More quantitatively, however, there we go. We want to take a model-based approach where we can fit a bunch of different models of growth, logistic or exponential or piecewise mixes of the two, and find the best model, the model that best explains our data based on a likelihood method. And we also vary the change point at which the different piecewise models can happen. So this is by far the best match based on the likelihood method, and we estimate a change point between a model of logistic growth and exponential growth between like 4,000 and 6,000 years ago. So to go into a little more detail about the model fitting, not too much, we randomly sample about 2,500 points from our our density curve. This is the same number of independent sites that we have. And then we use a simple likelihood model either for an exponential, where we have beginning population size and growth rate parameters, or a logistic model. So here, K is kind of the carrying capacity that you reach. And these are kind of standard likelihood methods that you can use. And then when we have multiple piecewise variations on them, we'll have an additional parameter of the timing of the change from one of the models to the other. So then you just calculate the likelihood or the log likelihood, and you can compare these methods using like BIC or AIC methods. We also have the additional ability when we fit these models to look at the growth rates based on these curves without over-interpreting these kind of squiggly lines. And we can see plotting the growth rate over time here. We have an initial really rapid growth of about 3.5% per generation. That means that the population doubles approximately every 20 generations. This is in line with kind of the upper limit of what you see in hunter-gatherer populations today, and is really on par with the recent explosive growth that's estimated for the last 3,000 or 4,000 years that's said to be kind of extreme in other parts of the world. There's no real net increase in the population size for this long period, about 4,000 years, and then renewed growth at a slower but still large rate of about 0.6% per generation. Putting that into specific population size terms, the y-axis is plotting the fold increase in population size. So for example, if you start with one individual 14,000 years ago, how many would you have at 2,000 years ago? That's about, if I remember correctly, 617. But we estimate, say 1,000 individuals or 100 individuals. We don't know how many people initially entered or were in the population about 14,000 years ago, so that's why it's kind of this fold increase. And this is roughly what we would call the carrying capacity. One thing that's notable is more than half of the growth of the population size occurs within the last 3,500 years during this exponential phase. So just as another line of evidence that these two phases are in fact distinct, we can borrow from the ecological literature as a way to interpret logistic growth. So we are plotting here the density versus the change in density over time. And we're using density as a proxy for growth and the change in growth rate. So when you have a logistic curve, as a population kind of goes towards their carrying capacity, they're still increasing in size, but they're increasing at a slower rate. So that's basically what you're plotting here. As the size gets bigger over time, the red curve shows the rate of change is getting lower. And that's not true for the blue phase, which is that exponential growth phase. And this is kind of a classic signature you see in everything from yeast models and bacteria to new mammals in a new habitat. So humans are really bound by carrying capacity and resources too, even at this large continental scale and lasting for thousands of years. So one kind of interesting side note is there's a hypothesis, particularly in European prehistory, about boom and bust cycles as part of the Neolithic. As you shift to agriculture, maybe you get overcrowded or poor nutrition or diseases or intergroup conflict. There's been this kind of pattern, but kind of mixed evidence for it, depending on the population you're studying. And we see some not particularly strong, but reasonable evidence for a similar pattern over that 4,000-year period of stasis in South America. So just to explain this plot, we simulate a constant population size using estimating material dated as a Poisson process, which means you would expect a uniform distribution over time of material. But this is, again, people leave material in calendar time, and we have to take into account the calibration process. So we uncalibrate the dates, convert them to radiocarbon dates, and then recalibrate them. And these gray lines here and here mark the middle 98% of the simulations that we have. The black line is our data. So you can see that our data for the most part is within the 98% confidence region. There are these oscillating regions outside of it. And since this method isn't taking, this 98% confidence interval isn't taking into account autocorrelation in the data, it's really surprising that you would go from one end of the confidence interval to the other end repeatedly. So we use another, still conservative, summary statistics, which is the variance. So for each of those 200 simulations, we're plotting here a histogram of the variance in the density observed. So that's really just a measure of, if you have a mean here, how far away from the mean each one of those goes. And the observed data, this is the general distribution for the simulated constant population size, and this observed data is way out here. And this is still conservative because it doesn't take into account autocorrelation. So that's kind of an interesting kind of suggestion but no, I wouldn't take it as concrete proof yet. So just to kind of start to sum up continental patterns of growth, we have from about 15,000 to 11,000 years ago, expansion into a new uninhabited and resource-rich territory. And this was really rapid. Then in this early Middle Holocene period, there's kind of an extended period of stasis, potentially boom and bust, and it's kind of surprising in such a large temporal and geographic scale. And finally, we have this pattern of renewed population growth and large geographic variation. So if you remember back to the kernel density plots, I should have put another one here, you see these really strong growths in population centers that are known to have large societies, all the northern and central Andes, but really nothing is happening in Patagonia, and that's consistent with what we know about where people were shifting to sedentism and agricultural societies and where they largely remain hunter-gatherers. There's really a need for more interpretation based on the climatic data because there's huge regional variation in the climate change that occurred during the mid-Holocene, and it's kind of still unclear how to tease those factors apart. So just looking a bit more at the interpretation of these patterns, this initial pattern of expansion is really a classic growth pattern seen throughout the animal kingdom. And we think that one potential hypothesis for this extended period of stasis versus the pattern that we see in other regions worldwide is this difference in the domestication history in South America, where you have low population densities throughout the time period, regional variation in the amount of domestication, perhaps lower interaction because of really different ecological niches. As I said, multiple crops and few animals, supplementing hunter-gatherers rather than actual societies that are more likely to trade with each other and interact and stay kind of in one place. Something interesting is that different types of communities, hunter-gatherer versus farming, and that's not really a necessarily distinction, but kind of ends of a spectrum, may react or probably will react to climate change in different ways, and that's one thing we want to look further into as we look at regional variation. And finally, this interesting period where rather than during this initial period of domestication, it takes another 4,000 years before really renewed population growth happens. And this is particularly interesting because there's large geographic variation that accords nicely with what we know about which regions kind of are shifting to this lifestyle. But it's also a nice counterpart to kind of worldwide patterns of how we talk about the shift to agriculture and the effect of demography. Most of what we know, or most of what we talk about as general theory about the shift to agriculture is based on the European Neolithic, and there's kind of this canonical, as you move to agriculture, you get these really large societies and increase in birth rates. But it hasn't been clear until we looked at South America that there might be this decoupling between an actual sedentary society or like economic system rather than just the stability of having domesticated crops and animals. And with that, I want to thank you for listening. More methodological details are available in our paper. And I want to thank particularly my co-authors, all the archaeologists that have excavated and dated the samples that we use in this analysis. And I want to say there's also lots more work to do. For example, for this crowd, do we see either similar or different patterns in the Amazon, and why? How does that interact with the ecology and the population history of the Amazon, particularly in the last kind of couple thousand years, say 2,000 to 4,000 years ago? And as one last thing, I just want to mention this is part of a larger working group that's really interested in megafaunal extinctions. They're mainly paleontologists, a mix, kind of a large international group that's led by Tony Barnowski, who got me involved in this project. So, thank you.